She dropped the priceless porcelain plate and watched it shatter like reputation across marble. Each white shard a small exclamation point in a room that had never seen emotion louder than the soft click of heels. Valentina Moretti stood perfectly still, silk sleeve brushing a fallen fragment as if to steady it, eyes all knife-edge and winter light. The staff held their breath. The chandeliers held their dust. Outside, the city thrummed oblivious. Inside, something that had always been ordered, like a garden pruned to geometric perfection, began to prick and bend under a foreign wind. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Sofia Alvarez had meant for the plate to slip. She had rehearsed the motion in the back of a van, in an abandoned kitchen, in the hollow of her palm where calluses mapped debt and anger like old cartography. But watching Valentina's face, so composed it could have been carved, crack into a flinch, was small, exquisite permission. Sofia's mouth tugged into a crooked grin that had gotten her through pregnancy, temp jobs, and more humiliation than she had words for. The grin was not mockery, it was recognition. There was a woman before her, not an icon, and Sofia had found the seam. "You've made a grave mistake," murmured Katerina, the housekeeper, voice thin with fear that was half loyalty and half superstition. Her hands hovered over a broom that would not collect the shards of that moment. Valentina's reply was a quiet arithmetic of control. "Mistakes can be remedied," she said, and the room believed her, because Valentina's remedies were always a measure too cold to cut themselves. Lawyers, hush money, the kind of favors that reshaped people into pavement. She inclined her head as if to forgive and as if to measure. Her smile was a blade folded back into silk. "Get up, finish the table." Sofia obeyed like someone who'd been taught 1,000 ways to take a beating and still breathe. She swept, but let her movements linger, an ornamental rebellion. In the servants' quarters that night, the cameras that lined the corridors for insurance and for Luca's peace of mind captured her crooked smile in a grainy loop that would later be polished into a viral taunt. Someone would call it audacity, someone else would call it treason. Valentina had been 19 when she married Luca Moretti to seal a deal that tasted of smoke and promise. She had gone into a room with armored men and come out with a name that doubled as a shield and a sentence. Over the years, she learned the finer arts, how to temper fear into respect, how to wield silence like a currency, how to let the world believe there was more formality than there was feeling. Where Luca's empire marched in broad, brutal steps, Valentina moved in margins. Charitable dinners that laundered headlines, a public laugh that could stop a scandal, pastries that the press photographed as if wealth were sugar-dusted and harmless. People feared her because she never looked afraid. The staff called her Lala Lama in private because her elegance had an edge that could slice illusions into neat, quiet pieces. Her name abroad was a punctuation mark, ownership and warning folded into one. Men who thought themselves dangerous watched their own hands around knives. Women who envied her beauty learned the vocabulary of restraint, the sleepless eyes, the phone calls at midnight, the ledger of apologies she kept like a rosary. Power in the Moretti household was proximity to Luca. To be near the dawn was to be near leverage. Sofia's arrival had been unremarkable on paper, a temp with a resume that hinted at culinary school and a lot more life. Her references were simple: a church volunteer, an aunt, a landlord who said she paid late and always with coins of regret. Luca's staff needed new hands. Temp agencies existed to place them. Life went on. Sophia walked into the palazzo with a broom and a tray and a back that flexed like a spring. She was small in the wide rooms, an underscore rather than headline, and that invisibility had been her trade for years. But she carried a quiet engine. Before the broom was a laptop. Before the tray, a list. For years, she had watched her brother Anton fight for a company swallowed by shell firms and legal fog. His injury, an industrial accident in a factory she could name by its rust stains, had been classified as a contractor's oversight, then a bankruptcy, then a misfiled form that evaporated accountability. Whoever profited from the collapse of that line had ties and habits that smelled like Moretti money. Acquisition notices, shareholder slips with names that vanished, ledgers with columns left blank on purpose. Anton had gone from son of a small town to another number in a ledger, and Sophia had learned to measure injustice in digits. The first time she saw Valentina close up was at a gala that smelled of roses and reputation. Valentina moved among donors and donors' wives with the practiced attention of someone watering walls. She smiled at a child who would inherit nothing and laughed at a joke that was economy. From across the room, Sophia watched and thought, this woman's proximity to Luca is where the world tilts. If you wanted to know who pulled the strings inside the empire, you observed the strings nearest knot. Sophia tried to file the thought away. She was supposed to be invisible. Humiliation, for Sophia, was currency. It bought attention and sometimes passage. She had been humiliated by cafeteria managers who threw away her student credit, by bosses who docked her wages for imaginary faults, by men who smirked because law allowed them. The plan, if you could call it a plan, was small and surgical. Unbalance the symbol, snip a thread, watch the system cough. She would humiliate Valentina in public, let the clip travel like a gossip-fueled virus, prompt a crack in the polished veneer. Once the Don reacted, the house would tremble. People would take sides. A ledger might show its underbelly. Sophia would watch, harvest data, insert a seed. She had not counted on the sensation that moved under Valentina's skin when the porcelain fell, an almost acknowledgement that surprise had arced across her face and been met with a human, crooked response rather than fear. It unsettled Sophia more than it should have. In the servile hush that followed, she would have sworn the Iron Woman had exhaled. Not surrender ever, but something that resembled recognition. The viral clip, when it arrived in the underbelly of social feeds and the private channels where the syndicate's lieutenants traded rumors like weapons, did what Sophia hoped and what everyone feared. It was a 2-minute grainy loop of the plate's fall and Valentina's tight, cold smile, not of fury, but of something thinner, displaced. The caption was a single line, "La Llama stumbles." In chat rooms, in encrypted groups, people who profited from fear laughed like rookies at a debut. They watched the blade blunted. Luca sighed differently. The Don's rage was not the explosive, cinematic kind. It was an infrastructural rearrangement. He measured threats in disruption to his architecture. A clip that eroded respect was as dangerous as a failed shipment. He called on the phone at midnight. His voice was a dark cello, steady and full of promise that broke things into the shapes he wanted. "Find her," he said. The words a decree. "Bring her to me." Valentina listened to Luca the way one listens to an earthquake forecast. Her life was a cartography of compromises leading to a coastline she never wanted to stand upon. She had made bargains, yes, financial sleight of hand to keep family members fed, calls to men with gray hair and moral elasticity to smooth a dangerous rumor, but always with an eye on the horizon. Keep the Moretti name untarnished. Keep Luca's hands clean of scandal that could be prosecuted by petty men wielding righteous banners. Her power had always been derivative, magnified by her supposed alignment with Luca's will. The clip lunged at that derivation and found a seam. Inside the palazzo, the staff divided. Some sided instinctively with Valentina, fearful of change, protective of the order that kept them paid and alive. Others cheered the exposure. A glimpse of humanity, even weakness, was a crack you could slide into. Katerina tightened the rules. No phones, no sharing stories. But gossip is water. It finds cracks. In the staff kitchen, Sophia saw a woman she liked, a child whose school fees depended on someone's sense of order, and realized how intertwined her small acts would be with people's livelihoods. She had not meant to hurt innocence. She had meant to hurt systems. That night, as the palazzo exhaled into uneasy sleep, Sophia sat on a narrow bed and opened the laptop she kept tucked like contraband. Her fingers moved with the surety of someone whose other life had been made of code and patience. She checked a list: email addresses, shell company nodes, an IP trace that curved like a map. She had spent 2 months mapping the Moretti periphery, the charities that funneled money into clean accounts, the construction companies that moonlighted as fronts, the offshore firms with names like seas. The humiliation was a wedge. The ledger was a prize. She only needed time to pry. Valentina, alone in a bedroom the color of winter roses, unfolded the day's events like someone reading a dossier on herself. She dressed and undressed in the silence of someone who was always rehearsing reactions. She called on favors she had tucked away: an editor, a whisperer, a lawyer, small tools to mollify public opinion. But she also felt a strange current she did not name: curiosity. The woman who had dropped the plate had bent rules with a smile that felt like a dare. That feeling was dangerous because it was human. In another wing of the palazzo, Luca convened his inner circle. Maps were spread, names circled, reputations quantified. He spoke in terms of infrastructure, sabotage, retribution, containment. There would be money spent and, if necessary, blood. The Moretti Code allowed for retribution to be clinical. The Don's punishments were always a ledger with interest. Yet his eyes found Valentina in the room as if to measure whether her calm had been eroded. She met his gaze and did not flinch, but the plate's star remained between them, an accusation she could not fully polish away. Outside, the city kept turning, its neon indifferent. In the palazzo, a small-town woman with a crooked smile had left a hairline fracture in a dynasty of control. Inside that hairline, 2 women, one made of silk and calculation, the other of grit and hidden code, would begin to orbit one another in a way neither expected. The first act of any rebellion is recognition, and the first recognition was humiliation. The rest would be about choices: revenge, alliance, survival, or something far riskier: connection. Valentina woke before dawn because the palazzo had taught her to mistrust sleep. It was in the quiet that dangers gathered like moths. She lay still for a long time, listening to the furnace murmur and the distant clip of someone opening a gate, the house settling into grudges. The night after the plate, she had dreamt of plates, innumerable, stacked, all of them spinning like revolutionary emblems, until one slipped and everything below it cracked. Morning found her in a robe of gray silk, coffee untouched on the bedside table, her mind assembling contingencies as if they were chess pieces she must not let topple. The first contingency was public. Valentina moved through the palazzo like water along a sculpture, if water could also be cold lead. She attended a breakfast where donors smiled and newspapers arrived with neutral faces. Her assistant, Marco, briefed her with hands that trembled slightly. He had the look of someone who polished bronze for a living and therefore feared fingerprints. "They're already spinning historic footage," he said, voice small. "They've pulled archival charity events, juxtaposed with the clip. Opinion is fracturing into 2, sympathy and mockery." Valentina nodded. Sympathy would not save them. Mockery could metastasize. "Find the source," she said, quietly, She did not specify who should be quiet. It was assumed. Her mind worked like a safecracker who had never stopped pretending to be respectable. Test the tumblers, apply heat, listen for the soft metallic surrender. She scheduled interviews, measured, bland pauses where she could show vulnerability and refuse it at the same time. At noon, she stood under the galleries, hands folded with the ease of a woman who could let the press photograph her as if she were nothing more than curated grief. Each smile was calibrated, each line a fencing parry. By the time Sophia set up her next sweep, a scrape at a ledger's metadata, a tiny crack in an email header, she had already become heavier than she intended. The clip had opened doors. Private messages from strangers, invitations to speak to faceless blogs, offers of money for a better angle. Every attention complicated the plan. She had not imagined the human fallout, watching her like a ripple arcing through a pond of lives that mattered to other people. She told herself it was a necessary cruelty. Anton's name was a hot coal at the center of her hands. She could not drop it. Her laptop hummed like an animal ready to pounce as she navigated a maze of anonymizers and proxies. She had a footprint now inside the Palazzo's perimeter networks thanks to a disgruntled maintenance contractor whose loyalty had been purchasable with a month's wages and a half-truth about a promised electrician's job. Through that doorway, she had peered into schedules and supplier lists and, briefly, the soft life of Valentina's meticulously annotated calendar. Salon appointments, donor lunches, and, curiously, an entry labeled LM Private. Curiosity should have been a dead end, but curiosity, in the presence of grief, becomes a weapon. Sophia found reasons to linger in public spaces, to fold herself into the Palazzo's hum and see how the household's order flexed around the scandal. She watched a young footman hesitate when Valentina passed and then smooth the pause with a practiced bow. She watched Katerina scold the cooks for gossip too loudly and felt a twinge of guilt. Katerina was an island of loyalty that had once sheltered a woman who loved a son. The more she watched, the more Sophia's neat lines of culpability blurred. The men who would profit from a tainted Moretti were not all monsters. Some were old enough to have eaten their way through better intentions and still retained the reflex to protect the familiar. The push-pull tightened when Luca called an emergency gathering of the household's lieutenants. The dining room where they met smelled of citrus and lemon oil, meant to disguise harder scents. Luca's presence compressed the room's air. He did not have to scream to terrify. He spoke softly about infrastructure and enemies and the need to remind people what happened to those who destabilized the household. "We will make an example," he said, and his lips did not smile. "But not tonight. Let the fear fester. We will choose the right blade." Valentina listened while looking at the map pinned to the wall, a web of lines connecting shell companies, a cartographer's cruelty. She did not speak. Silence for her was not absence, it was an arsenal. But the silence carried weight. It was read by everyone in the room as consent. After the meeting dispersed, Luca lingered by her side, a hand on the small of her back that was civilized and proprietary. "You handled the press well," he said, voice private. "But you left room. They smelled fear." His nearness was a ledger entry of its own. Valentina felt a familiar contraction of shame and calculation. "I gave them a pattern," she replied, the words soft-edged. "People like patterns." Her meaning, let them stitch this into the narrative they wanted. An old woman scorned by a small-town troublemaker. And the house could reassemble. Her eyes sought him. "We should find her, quietly." Luca's hand tightened a fraction, a punctuation. "Find her," he repeated. "Bring the woman to me. I will decide her fate." Sophia's traces, meanwhile, moved in a parallel current. She poked at a server flagged with a name she recognized from Anton's acquisition file, a firm called Ondine Construction. There it was again, a deposit, a transfer, a shell moving money into an account with a short life. Something unspooled in her. For months, she had cataloged wrongs into a list long enough to be dizzying. Now, with a single thread, she could start to unravel a seam. She clicked where her hands had been taught to click and found a directory that had been left poorly protected, an old error from inattentive IT that let a needle pass under a seam. Inside, scanned invoices, phrases like compensation deferred, and a notation of a payment to a subcontractor with a name she knew, an alias connected to a Moretti holding company. The world rearranged itself into accusation. That night, Sophia did something she had not planned. She sent an anonymous tip to a journalist whose byline had once questioned a Moretti public project. She told no story, provided no full ledger, only a hint, a breadcrumb with enough shine to be picked up and chewed. Her hands shook as if she were about to step into a confrontation for which she had not practiced. When the journalist called the next morning asking for verification, Sophia deflected and lied with the ease of someone who had lied to survive. The lie bought her time, and time could be converted into leverage. Valentina felt the ground shift beneath the palazzo when a rival family, Capuano, made a move on an old Moretti territory. It was thinly veiled as a legitimate bid for a chain of urban warehouses, but its timing was a message. Moretti was bruisable. For the first time in years, men whose livelihoods were tied to the family's reputation approached Valentina and offered counsel, not deference. They wanted decisions, and she had to give them. She convened a threadbare council in a sunroom lined with books whose spines had never been touched by her hands, but which made her look like a woman who read. "We hold," she said. "We do not attack. We show stability." The staff watched her, searching the seam between the woman everyone feared and the woman who might, in a private moment, be trembling. In the kitchen, Sophia stood with hands wrapped around a chipped mug, two cooks arguing about the risk of a publicized scandal. One mocked the clip. "She's a human, she drops plates." And the other shushed him, eyes careful. Sophia felt a new and strange thing, pity. She had not set out to stir empathy, but dignity, even among those paid to fold napkins, mattered. The plan had become a moral knot. Then the first fracture surfaced. Someone in the house had been recorded speaking to a contact in the Capuano family. A short message, a half-hearted joke about horses and warehouses, misread by a listener eager to make sense. It was not proof of betrayal, but it was enough in a house fashioned of nerves. Luca's men sharpened questions into weapons, interviews into pressurized rooms. They pushed until a cook confessed to a minor indiscretion, lending a car to a neighbor 8 months prior, and that confession was transformed into a rumor about loyalty. The palazzo breathed around the rumor like someone holding a match under damp wood, waiting for the spark to catch. Sophia watched the palazzo unravel into suspicion with a mixture of triumph and dread. Her plan had been to humiliate, to prod the machine, to let its grime show to light. She had not planned for the microeconomics of fear, how quickly a rumor could starve a family of trust. She began to see, with an unwilling clarity, the human cost of her rebellion. Anton's face hovered behind that understanding, his eyes narrowed in the memory of a man crushed by systems he could not name. The image gave her stubbornness and also a tremor of conscience. What if the ledger's exposure toppled livelihoods and did not free anyone? What would justice look like then? Valentina found herself increasingly haunted by moments of recognition, a gesture, a pause, that suggested the woman who dropped the plate was not simply a nuisance, but a mirror. Once, in a corridor, their paths brushed as Sophia carried linens past Valentina's study. Their eyes met in the flicker between servants and masters, and for a second both were unarmed. Valentina saw the crooked grin again, and underneath it a fatigue she understood intimately. Sophia saw the woman known as La Lama, and under the armor, a sliver of exhaustion she recognized as familial duty. Their meeting was a benign collision, but both walked away as if struck. The tension between them wound tighter when Valentina, prompted by a whisper from someone in her own staff, put forward a proposal others might call charity. She arranged for a small scholarship in the name of a donor, ostensibly a goodwill gesture to mend the public image, but practically a way to anchor the household's narrative of benevolence. For people who lived by optics, a scholarship was a visible heart. She had not meant it as a message to Sophia, but the more she considered it, the more the gesture felt like an invitation and an apology rolled into one. She watched the scholarship's application cycle with a secretive care she had not afforded to other projects. It reminded her, unpleasantly, of the small ways people survive by accepting crumbs. Sophia read about the scholarship notice on a freelance gossip site and felt a strange, jealous fury. She had never wanted pity, she had wanted restitution. The announcement irritated her for reasons beyond politics. It was a reminder of how the Morettis repackaged power into philanthropy and sold it as charity. She drafted a response, a biting, anonymous letter to the editor accusing the Morettis of laundering respectability, but paused. Anton had wanted something else, and the kernel of his insistence was not to burn everything down, but to change the calculus. The letter felt like vengeance. She saved it as a draft and closed the tab. Outside, the rival news cycles multiplied. A prosecutor in the city, a man whose ambitions were carved out of hunger, called for inquiries into shell companies. He had been paid by someone whose fingerprints could be tracked and who had a vested interest in seeing the Morettis' weekend. Sophia had not sold her tip to him, but she knew it would not be long before various interests compiled the small stones she dropped into a landslide. Each new public inquiry felt like a ripple that could become the wave she wanted, but there was no pause between wave and storm. Then came the most dangerous obstacle. The revelation that Sophia was not merely a maid, but a woman with ties to a rival. Lucas Consigliere, a man who kept the family's secrets like a geologist keeps maps of seismic fault lines, came to Valentina with files. "She's connected," he said. "Not just to petty causes. She answers to Raphael Cernik." The name arrived like a fist. Raphael was a CEO whose corporate war had escalated into a chess game with the Morettis. He had motive and a thirst that looked like a map of enemy territory. The Consigliere's files suggested that Sophia had access to places only insiders could reach. Payroll, procurement, the soft spots of the house. Valentina's world narrowed. If Sophia was a plant, an agent of a rival, then the humiliation had been not a trivial prank, but an incision in a war. Her heart, if she allowed it to be more than a ledger, pounded not with fear, but calculation. She had to decide. Treat Sophia as an enemy to be crushed, or as a tool to be used. The two options mirrored the same violence. Yet Valentina, who had learned the subtleties of extraction, felt curiosity and a darker, private longing to see the woman behind the subterfuge with her defenses down. Sophia felt the net tighten when Katerina's whisper reached her that she was under suspicion. She noticed small changes. A careful glance from Marco, a waiter who no longer filled her water, a housemaid who did not touch her hand in passing. The palazzo was a small world that could bury you or spit you out depending on the direction of gossip. She had always known the risk of being discovered. She had not expected the loneliness of it. The revelation that she might be tied to Raphael Cernik was both worse and less than the truth. It put her on a map and boxed her into villains and heroes, roles she had always refused. That evening, when she least expected it, Valentina sent for her. She arrived at the study wearing the practical armor of those summoned by the powerful. A clean apron, hair pinned back, palms slightly calloused. Valentina stood behind a broad desk, Hands folded, a porcelain cup in front of her that might have once been part of the shattered set. "Sit," Valentina said. Sophia, who had rehearsed answers and refusals and had even prepared the lie of being merely playful, sat and felt the palazzo's air compress. That was the moment where stakes became choices: confession or deflection, courage or concealment. They both knew the rules had changed. The palazzo hummed, waiting for the next sound. Valentina's study smelled of old paper and lemon oil, a careful fragrance intended to make decisions seem inevitable. The lamp pooled light over a map of the city, over names circled like small prayers. She did not offer Sophia tea. The cup on the desk was more theater than hospitality. Valentina watched Sophia as a surgeon watches a wound, patiently, measuring, not yet cutting. "You humiliated me," she said, the sentence not an accusation so much as a fact to be inventoried. "You knew what that would do." Sophia's hands were folded in her lap, knuckles pale beneath the skin. She had practiced an answer in the back of bodega alleys and in phone calls at 2 in the morning, steady, evasive, honest enough to be plausible. Now the words that formed were rougher, smaller. "I didn't do it for sport," she replied. "I did it because some things get fixed with light, and some things only move when you nick them so they bleed out the rot." Valentina's gaze caught a flicker, something that might have been anger, might have been appreciation, and Sophia's stomach tightened. "You were supposed to be invisible," Valentina said. "You were supposed to be a seam. Instead, you became spectacle." "You were supposed to protect them," Sophia answered, voice low. "They weren't yours to protect the way you think they were. You make safety into a marketable product and sell it like prayer." "My brother, Anton," Valentina interrupted softly, as if the name was a ledger entry she had already reconciled. "I know who your brother is. I know the file of his case. Do you think I like being where I am? I didn't choose this because I wanted to be untouchable. I chose it because choice costs people. Do you have any idea what choices cost in this house?" Sophia's mouth went dry. She had rehearsed anger, the righteous sort that sounded like a bell. Instead, she felt the weight of names: Anton, Katerina's son, Marco's mortgage. The palazzo was a web of small economies, fragile dominoes that tilted into ruin if a hand moved too abruptly. "They cost lives sometimes," she said. "They cost options. You took the shape of safety and kept it from people like my brother. I wanted to expose that." Valentina's fingers steepled. Expose and correct are different verbs. When you make a theater of it, you give other people the right to come in with pitchforks. You make it easy for those who don't want justice but want spectacle. Do you understand the difference? Sophia did, in the way one understands the difference between a blade and a scalpel. Both cut, but only one heals. "Sometimes the scalpel needs to draw blood," she said. "You can scrub at a wound forever, masks, PR, scholarships, without ever reaching the infection. I wanted to show the infection." Valentina's laugh was soft and surprised, like pressed silk pulled taut. "Scholars and saints alike have argued over whether charity is balm or bandage." She leaned forward in a way that made the lamp's light lay out the planes of her face, sharp, precise. "You are not the first to want to punish the house for its sins. You are the first to do it with a smile." Silence settled between them like a verdict waiting to be read. Outside the palazzo, the city's morning life continued, indifferent. Inside, 2 women, each working the malleable edges of power, sat at a table where the rules had been rewritten by a dropped plate. Valentina surprised herself by reaching for the cup of porcelain and turning it in her hands, as if testing the object for echoes. She could call the dawn. She could have Sophia removed, quietly disappeared into a back room where reputations were cleansed with threats and paper. That was the ledger's logic. Instead, she asked the question she had not allowed to surface for years. Why do you hate us enough to burn the place down? Hate was too blunt a word for Sophia's motives. She had a ledger in her head with margins full of arithmetic, dates, names, transfers. Hate felt childish next to that precise catalog. "I don't want to burn it," she said. "I want to change it." Anton died because a line on a ledger said his injury was cheaper to bury than to fix. Sometimes you have to nudge the shape of things until the ledger shows a truth. The humiliation was the nudge. Valentina's expression softened and then gathered itself again. "You think ledger and life are separate. They're the same thing here." She tapped the map. "You show me lines and names, and you expect me to be the villain who profited while a child was hurt. But I have made choices, ugly and often selfish, to keep the household whole. Do you know what it feels like to choose between two lives because your husband needs a clean headline?" Sophia's head tilted. "Is that a confession or a justification?" "Both," Valentina said. "I didn't want this life the way people imagine because I didn't want the power. I wanted less harm. But less harm is still harm. I'll own that." Her voice thinned, and for a moment the silk armor showed a seam. "You exposing me is inconvenient and dangerous. It also gives me information. So tell me something true. Are you working for Cernic?" Sophia's cheeks flamed. The name was blowback. Raphael Cernic was a voracious thing in the city, legal when it suited him, merciless when it didn't. The consigliere had planted a seed. It had taken root. "I did meet with his people," she admitted. "Once. I fed them a story and took their money for a week to move a few things. They thought they could control me. They couldn't. But I won't deny the meetings. If you want enemies, look there. They see weakness and try to profit." Valentina thought through the implications of the admission like a chess player calculating a defensive sacrifice. Cernic's involvement changed the argument from moral to strategic. If Sophia was a pawn in a larger game, the palazzo might be attacked not for justice but for conquest. And if Valentina allowed herself to be consumed in a spectacle, the enemy would do more than humiliate, they would take. "What do you want?" Valentina asked, stripped of eloquence. Sophia looked at her as if reaching for a vocabulary new to both of them. "Restitution," she said. "Not pity, not a scholarship that hides a wound. I want Anton's name cleared. I want the contractors exposed. I want the families who were blamed to be compensated. And I want the ledger corrected." Valentina's laugh was humorless. "And if the ledger cannot be corrected without breaking the palazzo, if the solutions you propose open floodgates that drown people who have nothing to do with the crimes you accuse—" Sophia swallowed. She had thought of that, the possibility that her action might cause collateral ruin that Anton had not asked for. "Then we find another way," she said. "But I can't go back to pretending nothing is wrong." They watched one another across the desk, two women mapping the same terrain in different cartographies, one by etiquette and avoidance, the other by code and accusation. In that moment, a precarious solidarity began to form. Not trust, not yet, but the recognition that each could be useful to the other. Valentina, with her access to the family's quiet organs, and Sophia with the hunger and the keys to the digital gates. "You can lead me to the nodes," Valentina said finally, "or I can have you expelled. You know the way this house makes choices. Choose." Her words were a test. They were also a doorway. Sophia's answer came like a breath she had held for years. "I can lead you. she said, "but I'll need guarantees. I need a promise that you're not just fixing your name for optics. I need evidence that you'll go after the real hands that profited from Anton's injury." Her eyes were steady, mapping the contours of the woman known as Lalama. "And I need you to stop pretending you are only the Don's shadow. You have power too, even if you hate it." Valentina considered the impossible promise and the ledger of consequences it implied. To ally with a woman who had publicly humiliated her was to make an admission that vulnerability could be tactical. To ally with her was also to risk Luca's wrath if the plan failed, or if it appeared she had colluded with a rival. But the alternative was clear: crush Sofia and risk greater exposure, or use her and risk becoming the villain she already suspected. There was something in Sofia's crooked grin that pulled, a dangerous gravity Valentina had not planned for. "Agreements must be written," Valentina said slowly, "but not in public. We do this quietly. You bring me the nodes, I use my channels to excavate. If you betray me, if you're a mole, I will ensure you disappear in a way that feeds legend. If I betray you, you will have my name." The threat and the offer were braided into one sentence: mutual destruction and mutual protection in the same breath. Sofia weighed the cadence of the promise like a coin, checking for forgery. "And your husband?" Valentina's face hardened for a heartbeat. Then something softer settled. "Luca will have to be maneuvered," she said. "You understand more than most that you cannot rewrite him. You can, however, make him see the benefit of a cleaner ledger, or you can make him fear the cost of ignoring it." The edges of that statement were dangerous. The word fear, when spoken about Luca, was a small incendiary. They both knew the risk. Aligning meant creating a new fracture within the household's architecture. It meant that some would see this as the ultimate betrayal. Others would see it as a surgical strike for justice. It meant the consigliere would not be pleased, and the Don's temper might become a strategy of its own: cruel, precise, irreversible. When Sofia stood to leave, the weight of the palazzo felt different. She was no longer simply a temp worker with an axe to grind. She was stepping into a rumor made real, into a pact that could save her brother's name or burn everything she had left. Valentina returned the porcelain cup to its saucer and touched the chipped edge the way a person touches a keepsake. They were, for now, allies of convenience. Both understood alliances could be love or war. Outside, a courier arrived with a packet of copies: new gossip, older accusations, a prosecutor's tentative interest. The palazzo shuddered as if anticipating a season. Inside, the quiet collusion between two women had begun to stitch a new map across old wounds. The lines drawn tonight would determine who lived, who was exposed, and who would get to call justice by its proper name. For the first time since the plate shattered, the palazzo felt as if it might not simply cleave along old fault lines. It might, under the weight of secrets and fractured loyalties, rearrange itself mid-breath. The question was not whether it would change, but what and who it would cost along the way. They began like conspirators, two women trading numbers and names in a room that had been used for diplomacy and executions alike. Valentina gave Sofia an envelope stuffed with access codes that looked like jewelry in the light, authorization to supplier accounts, passes for the service elevator, a list of vendors who moved in and out of the palazzo with motorcades and empty boxes. Sofia, in turn, slid over a decrypted map of Ondine's transactions and a seed phrase to a dormant server tucked behind a construction firm's payroll. They spoke in the soft shorthand of people bargaining with futures. "It must be surgical," Valentina said, voice low with the gravity of a surgeon planning a risky operation. No drama, no noise. She set conditions like delicate traps: timelines, fail-safes, kill switches. The palazzo needed to feel unchanged to the rest of the world, even while its innards were rearranged. We expose the right entries to the right people. We do not give prey to vultures. You will bring me nodes, I will open corridors. We will be ghosts. Sophia's grin was crooked and earnest. No theater then, just truth and the right scalpel. Her fingers hovered over Valentina's list and felt like an engine. She already imagined keystrokes becoming pressure points where the house's architecture would yield. But beneath the technical thrill, there sat a quieter pulse, something like trust flowering in a place that could kill for a rumor. It was dangerous and intoxicating. They moved in phases. Sophia infiltrated back-end servers, a whisper in switches, and a ghost in the building's maintenance schedule. She planted innocuous files, scans of Thier invoices, payroll anomalies, a supplier labeled simply V-Consults that led to a holding company long suspected but unprovable. Valentina used her channels in parallel. She called a favored editor who owed her an old favor and fed the man a curated leak, a set of documents that suggested corporate malfeasance without naming names. The journalist, hungry and cautious, pushed for confirmation. Valentina smiled and provided it, not in full, but in the form of corroboration that would force a journalist to pry. Luca, sensing tremors beneath his empire's skin, reacted with the methodical cruelty of a man who had never been surprised by the tides but knew how to redirect them. He ordered a tightening of the palazzo, security audits, new badges, a temporary lock on external communications where clients' names were visible. He also sent men to the supplier firms. They were men whose reputations could be polished with threats and money. He believed that pressure might flush out the provocateur and reassert the house's monopoly on fear. What he did not anticipate was the other blade Valentina held: persuasion. She met with a couple of lieutenants privately and told them of a strategy she framed as preservation rather than confession. "We have a leak," she said plainly. "We stop it, we control the narrative, we limit damage. Or we let outsiders pry the ledger and lose everything." For each man and woman she spoke to, some who had once polished her shoes and others who had once polished their resumes at the Don's feet, she offered a choice. Their loyalty would be rewarded with preservation instead of holy fury. Many agreed, not because they loved her, but because they feared the alternative. It was leverage converted to safety. As the weeks peeled away, the pressure cooker heated up. Press leaks blossomed with the kind of slow breadcrumb precision Sophia and Valentina intended. Charity funds misallocated, invoices for phantom consultants, a subcontractor whose insurance had been lapsed intentionally. Public outrage began its ritual, clumsy and righteous. Raphael Cernick's people smelled possibility and moved to amplify the scandal. The consigliere's files leaked to meet them. Luca's world of private war became public litany. And then they struck. The night chosen for its weather and its logic. Heavy rain makes for forgiving cameras, Valentina decided. She arranged a small gala under the guise of crisis management. Donors, a few journalists, community leaders, and the cameras of a charity she controlled. The palazzo shone as if nothing were wrong. Inside, the staff adjusted their uniforms with the neatness of a funeral. Valentina stood at the podium and spoke about accountability and charity in a voice that folded shame into civic language. It was the voice of a woman rehearsed to carry a nation's tragedies in a smile. While the cameras rolled, Sophia moved like a cat through the back corridors. She had prepped files on a thumb drive, proof of transfers, scanned contracts with forged signatures, a trail from Ondine to a Moretti holding company. She needed one person to carry the evidence out, a courier who was not on Luca's payroll, who had no loyalty to the palazzo, who understood the danger and the price. Valentina had arranged that courier, an old friend of her late mother who ran a printing press and owed Valentina a favor. The courier would ferry the data to an independent investigative firm and to the journalist with the old favor. As Sophia handed the thumb drive to the courier in the service elevator, the building's alarms stuttered, the result of a planned outage Valentina had scheduled to justify a temporary digital blackout. It was the perfect cover. The courier slipped out into the rain and vanished into the city, a small man with a briefcase and a conscience heavy enough to be courageous. If the files reached the right journalists, the Moretti ledger would be exposed. If not, Luca's men would find a mole and the palazzo would devour the intruder. They nearly failed because of an imperfect hinge. Caterina, whose loyalty was complex and maternal, grew suspicious of people moving in and out and reported an anomaly to Marco. He, jittery from fear, reported upward. Luca smelled a trap and sent a pair of men to intercept the courier. They were efficient and armed, and in the rain they closed in on the courier's taxi. Valentina heard the sound of a scuffle through the gala's muffled speakers and felt something cleave inside her that was older than survival. It was not just the ledger at stake now. It was the faces of the people who would be destroyed if the files never left the palazzo. She acted in the smallest, most defiant way she knew how. She moved in public to consume attention. She rose from the podium and walked to the side door, announcing with a voice that carried across the press and into the hallway that a courier had been accosted by men in plain clothes. Cameras followed her because drama sells. Luca's men followed because so often drama was a smokescreen. In the corridor outside the gala, a shadow struggle unfurled. Cabs, rain, a briefcase thrown and nearly crushed under a boot. Valentina shoved past a man who reached for the courier and found herself one hair's breadth from being recognized as both protector and traitor. Sophia, who had been counting seconds in the palazzo's dim corridors, sprinted into the same passage and met Valentina mid-chaos. Instinct propelled them. Sophia to shove the courier into a taxi, Valentina to block the aggressors. The two women, one in damage control heels, the other in a damp apron smudged with rain, moved as if they had rehearsed the same choreography. They lifted the courier into a cab and slammed the door just as the boot of a Moretti man slammed against the wheel. The car careened into traffic and disappeared through the rain like a promise. For Luca, watching from a doorway, fury and admiration warred. He could have killed the courier and punished the women. Instead, he did something more layered. He barked orders that reassured men they still had teeth, but in his chest something quieter stirred. The image of Valentina stepping into a weather designed to hide her courage. He cursed fate in syllables and then returned to the gala, appearing composed as a man seeing a storm as merely weather. The files did reach air. Journalists with independence and conscience published, and the city saw lines on a screen connecting Ondine payments to Moretti holdings. Contracts surfaced that looked like tissue paper, but revealed hidden engineering behind a corporate edifice. The Moretti name fractured under weight it had never been meant to bear in public. Investors grumbled. Rivals circled. Luca's men wanted retribution. Municipalities wanted explanations. The world tilted the way Sophia had wanted it to, and at the center of the tilt stood two women who had made their peace with risk. But victory never arrives without cost. The night a hitman, hired by a rival profiteer who smelled opportunity in a bleeding house, came for someone he thought vulnerable. He chose the wrong door. The intended target had not been Valentina or Sophia. It had been a junior lieutenant whose cooperation had been wavering. The bullet found instead a servant named Matteo, young, beloved, a son of Caterina's friend, who died with a wallet of the family's bread receipts in his pocket. The palazzo reeled. The household's fragile equilibrium cracked into 1,000 jagged decisions. Sophia found Matteo before they called the medics. She cradled a warm hand in her own and felt the weight of consequence like lead. The ledger's exposure had not simply toppled paper, it had cost a life. She wanted then to drop to the ground and confess everything, to throw up in the marble foyer and curse the moment she chose spectacle over stealth. Valentina, who arrived minutes later with a crowd of lieutenants and Lucas' shadow, stayed muted but present. She knelt, touched Matteo's face as if testing for breath she knew she would not find. The gesture was private, a woman's clasp on the cost of choices. Luca's reaction was a cold hurricane. He did not weep. He measured damage and named people to be punished in a voice the room obeyed because obedience meant survival. "We will find the shooter," he promised. "We will make this right." His face was immovable, but his hand found Valentina's shoulder in a gesture that was either comfort or possession. For a moment, Valentina looked like a child pinned to a map of responsibilities too large for her to carry. Her eyes met Sophia's across the cluster of men and gurneys and police lights, and for the first time since the plate shattered, there was recognition without armor. The look between them said what words could not. "We both made this decision. We both will have to pay." In the days that followed, with the city's eyes burning and the Senate of rivals circling, the alliance hardened into something resembling trust. Sophia moved with Valentina to unmask shell companies and quietly negotiate compensation for families hurt by long-buried practices. Valentina used the Don's resources to secure legal defenders for contractors whose names had been used as conduits without their knowing. Together, they staged a public relations counterpoint. Apologies that acknowledged faults, restitution plans that released funds quietly, and targeted transparency that would undercut opportunists who wanted spectacle without justice. It was messy, insufficient, and the only feasible path between annihilation and reform. Romance, if it could be called that in the fog of ledger and loss, arrived not as a sudden conflagration, but as a slow alignment, like the way two gears find each other and begin to turn in sync. Valentina found relief in Sophia's presence. A woman who laughed when things broke, who moved with a confidence that was not born of privilege. Sophia discovered in Valentina unexpected tenderness. The way she read the room, the way she shielded a cook from questioning, the way she mapped options in soft curves rather than knives. They shared cigarettes in hidden courtyards, exchanged pressured smiles across meeting tables, and at night slept with new arguments about risk and old ones about survival. Love here was contraband, and strategy folded into something that felt like solace. Sacrifice came as a private accounting. Valentina offered to end the marriage formally, an impossibility that would shatter the syndicate's architecture if Sophia wanted it. Luca would never accept a paper divorce, but Valentina's willingness to walk away from the only identity she had built signaled a new currency. Sophia, who had mapped revenge into orders of business, felt her heart twist. She did not want Valentina to sacrifice herself for the sake of a ledger. She wanted restitution and honesty, and she wanted to be known without being used. "I don't want you to disappear," Sophia told her one night, fingers tracing the scar at Valentina's wrist where a bracelet had once been too tight. "I want you to choose what you are." Valentina answered with a small, simple surrender. She kissed Sophia in the darkened conservatory, a touch equal parts apology and claim. It was not spectacle. It was a quiet revolution. In that kiss, each offered up a piece of themselves, Valentina her brittle power and Sophia her hunger for truth. Outside, the city kept turning, the syndicate recalibrated, and the press calculated winners and losers. Inside the palazzo, a maid and a don's wife embraced and measured the cost of the choice they had made. The ledger would always be stained, but for the first time, there were entries for care. They were not done. The storm would not end with one night of bravery and a journalist's byline. There would be trials, threats, betrayals, and the inevitable negotiation with Luca's temper. But a new axis had formed. Two women, once at odds, now in alliance, willing to risk reputations and lives to pull a ledger toward truth. Redemption did not look like absolution. It looked like work, like small, painful stitches that might one day hold. As rain swelled new gutters and the city counted its headlines, Valentina and Sofia stood on the palazzo's roof and watched the lights spread like bruises and promises. They had stolen a moment to breathe. Below them, the household moved under the new weight of choices. Above them, the sky was raw and honest. For the first time since the plate fell, both felt the dangerous, sweet vertigo of choosing someone in a world that demanded only survival. It was a risk neither of them had expected to take, and a risk that, if it held, would change everything. Valentina and Sofia stood on the palazzo's roof as dawn bled into a brittle sky. They had stitched small mercies into a broken ledger, and now watched what those stitches bought. A city that still spun, a household that breathed, and a future neither had fully dared to imagine. Rain had polished the cobbles, the glass of the avenues gleamed, and somewhere below a courier waited for word. Valentina folded her hands around Sofia's, the gesture simple and literal, two palms proving that bargains could be human. "We lost someone," Sofia whispered, voice caught between apology and accusation. "We did," Valentina said. "We are paying. We will pay." They spoke of small reconciliations, funds redirected, subcontractors held accountable, names publicly cleared where they deserved clearing, and hushes turned into admissions. It was imperfect, political, expensive, and real. In the weeks after the exposé, the city shifted like tectonic plates. Prosecutions began, shells dissolved, and small payments found their way to widows and widowers who had been counted as collateral. Luca's wrath found new outlets, his empire contracted and rewired, but he also learned a costly lesson: power left untended rotted. He did not forgive willingly, yet he began to accept that preservation sometimes required admission. Between the two women a language grew, blunt honesty, tactical tenderness, and a stubborn refusal to let fear be the only currency. They became public in private. Sofia's code unmasked accounts, while Valentina's name hardened into someone who could wield consequence for the right reasons. They argued in the mornings, kissed in the evenings, and arranged funerals and fundraisers with equal care. Matteo's death never left them. It was a ledger line and a wound. They erred, made recompense, and kept moving. Months later, a quiet tribunal cleared names that needed clearing, and a court convened against those who had hidden profit. The Moretti world did not crumble. It reformed, jagged and wary. On the roof, they promised nothing grand and everything small: late-night confessions, shared cigarettes, and a pact to keep each other from being alone. Sofia smiled, crooked and honest. Valentina let a soft sound that was almost a laugh and almost a prayer. Below, the palazzo hummed with consequence, and above, the sky cleared, pale as bone. In the end, the plate did not symbolize ruin, but the moment two women chose one another. Their hands stayed clasped as the city unfolded beneath.